How many people on Easter Island cut down the last tree? And when they did, what were they thinking? Did they understand that it was the end, or did they just believe there was another forest somewhere? That question opens one of the most profound books on the fate of civilizations. Collapse is not just a historical work, but a mirror reflecting humanity, from small, isolated islands in the Pacific to once mighty empires that crumbled. From developing modern nations to seemingly invincible industrial powers, all are placed on the same scale. Can humans learn to live within their own limits? The book doesn't recount the past as a mere archive of memories, but as a test of the future. It outlines a chain of causes, not to condemn, but to illuminate: blind overconfidence, cultural arrogance, decisions that are rational in the short term but destructive in the long term. The Vikings starved amidst abundant fish because they considered eating fish a lowly act. On Easter Island, people cleared forests to erect statues, believing that the taller the statues, the more compassion the gods would show. And in the modern world, we continue to expand factories, mine resources, and burn fuels, believing that our intellect and technology will save us from natural limits. But if every previous civilization thought the same, what makes the present different? When every action is veiled with the reason for development, is development still a salvation, or has it become the most sophisticated form of self-destruction? Perhaps the most terrifying thing is not collapse itself, but the ability to repeat mistakes even when knowing the outcome. And the question for the reader, the listener, or anyone living in this century is, amidst the countless advancements humanity prides itself on, have we truly progressed, or are we just walking in circles like the people on Easter Island, searching for a tree that no longer exists? Under the vast skies of Montana, where light stretches endlessly across grasslands and snow fringes the Bose Mountains, people often say that you only need to look up to see the entire universe. It was there that I met Stanford O., a man who had spent almost his entire life in cramped laboratories in California, then unexpectedly found peace in the clear waters of the West. He recounted that as youth faded and the stresses of scientific life drained his spirit, a friend once told him to go fishing to remember what it felt like to truly live. And Montana became the place where he found that feeling. A place vast enough to contain the weariness of modern man, serene enough to quiet a troubled mind. I understood him immediately, for I had come here myself many years ago, a Boston boy who had never seen a sky free of smog. As my car traversed the long road south from Mahler, the valley opened up like a field of light. Two mountain ranges rose like deep blue walls. The first feeling wasn't beauty, but humility. Humanity was so small before nature. I have returned here many times, not just for the scenery, but because this stillness made me realize what the world is losing: the ability to pause and see oneself. Montana is a land of paradoxes. It's the third largest state in the U.S., but has one of the smallest populations. Here, there are vast fields, rivers teeming with fish, mountains perpetually covered in snow, yet it is also one of the poorest states. Wealthy individuals from California and New York flock here, buying land and building luxurious homes amidst the prairies. Meanwhile, those born here leave after high school because there are no jobs, no future. There are places where during the day you hear the buzz of chainsaws and the smell of coal smoke, but by evening, it's the lights from billionaires' mansions of poor land that houses some of America's richest people. For this reason, Montana is like a microcosm of the world: beautiful, vast, and full of contradictions. I once lived in Los Angeles amidst endless traffic and neon lights, but whenever I returned to Montana, I felt pulled out of that rhythm. Here, the sky is so wide that it forces people to contemplate their own insignificance. I remember those afternoons standing in the fields, looking towards the distant mountains. It felt like being on the border between life and silence. But behind that beauty, I knew Montana carried deep wounds. The land was eroded from mining, forests were devastated. Rivers carried toxins from abandoned copper mines. The so-called pristine wilderness was merely an illusion. Montanans pride themselves on their independence and free spirit. They distrust the federal government, believing those in Washington understand nothing about this land. They revere the land as part of their soul, yet they are also the ones who carve mountains, dig mines, and burn forests to make a living. Freedom sometimes becomes a double-edged sword. They want to control everything, including nature. And the result is that nature begins to resist. I once heard a local friend say, "We don't need the government to tell us what to do with our land, but now we can't drink the well water on our own farms anymore." Montana was once rich thanks to copper mines, timber, and agricultural land. But that wealth vanished as quickly as the short summer here. As mines were depleted and forests clear-cut, only barren lands, dead lakes, and ghost towns remained. I once passed through Butte, a city once called the richest hill on earth, now just a giant hole filled with deep red toxic water. In every river in Montana, there are traces of heavy metals, of a bygone mining history. Behind the glittering snow-capped mountains lies the dust of a decaying economy. When I spoke with the locals, I realized they were not indifferent. They loved Montana. It's just that each loved it in a different way. Some loved it by preserving, others by exploiting. I once asked Tim H., a rancher, what he thought about resource extraction. He looked out at the field and said slowly, "I just want my children to be able to live here as I have. If there are no jobs, who will stay?" That statement contained all the tragedy of Montana. Between love and destruction, there was only a belief. In every story I heard, I saw a glimpse of the world. What is happening in Montana is no different from what humanity is experiencing: development outpacing resilience, the conflict between profit and values, between the present and the future. Montana is not just a state, it is a mirror reflecting global destiny. When humans forget that land, water, and forests are not things to possess but extensions of life itself, they begin to lose both resources and soul. Under that sky, where winds from the Bows Range swept across the fields carrying the scent of dry pine, I realized one thing: collapse never comes from the outside. It begins with cracks in perception, from the moment people stop listening to the land that nourished them. Montana, with all its beauty and wounds, whispers a question the world cannot ignore. Do we truly know how to live with the place where we stand? People often say Montana is where time moves slower than the rest of America. But in reality, it doesn't stop. It's just that people here live in different temporal rhythms. No one agrees on the direction of the future. The polarization of Montana is not just economic, it lies in the soul of every citizen. Families who have been tied to this land for generations look at newcomers with a mix of suspicion and sadness. They remember a time when forests were dense, rivers were full of fish, and everyone knew each other's names. Newcomers, mostly city dwellers escaping the noise to find paradise, bring different values. They plant trees, build modern homes, talk about the environment and urban planning, while themselves contributing to rising land prices, making it impossible for natives to afford their own farms. I once sat in a small wooden cabin in Botus Valley, listening to a rancher shake his head and say, "They call us deforesters, but who will live without wood? Who will eat if we don't farm?" Across the road, an engineer from California who had recently moved told me, "If they keep exploiting like that, in 20 years there will be nothing left but dead land." Two men, two ways of loving Montana, both believing they are right. And because of that, they cannot understand each other. The division here does not stem from malice, but from different values nurtured by different circumstances. Montana has always been a land of free spirits. From the time of the first pioneers, they learned to live without relying on anyone, no government, no aid. They believed each person had to bear the consequences of their own actions. So when the federal government issued regulations on conservation, forest logging control, or land planning, Montanans' first reaction was outrage. "What does Washington know about our land?" a man said, his voice sharp. They sit there thinking this land belongs to the whole country, while we are the ones who live, work, and bury our loved ones here. That independent spirit is both a source of pride and a curse. Because they want to decide everything themselves, they also have to bear their own failures. In Jawali County, there is almost no zoning. Anyone can build or do whatever they want. Some erect cinemas in the middle of a field next to a biology lab, some turn agricultural land into resorts. No rules, just freedom. But that freedom also leads to fragmented fields, dammed rivers, and the poor being pushed further away. One afternoon, I drove with Rick Leibel, a businessman who had worked in high-tech in California before moving here. He drove through bumpy roads, telling me he came to Montana to find a real life. He wanted to teach his children how to grow vegetables, fish, and see the night stars. But then he sighed ironically. "We came here to escape the city, then we turn this place into another version of it." The craving to return to nature is precisely what causes nature to disappear. In the same region, I met Chip Pickman, a hunter and guide who made a living taking people into the forest. He was proud of his ability to read animal tracks, to listen to the wind to predict rain. But when I asked him about the environment, he just smiled. I don't believe the earth is warming. I believe everyone has to know how to live so it doesn't swallow them whole. He didn't hate nature. He believed he understood it better than anyone. It's just that he didn't believe in people, sitting in offices thousands of miles away, telling him what to protect. Montana is an endless dialogue between belief and reality. Everyone looks at the same river but sees different things. One sees water, another sees resources, another sees the soul of the land. I once sat by the Bot River watching local children throw stones into the water. They laughed loudly, unaware that the river had been so contaminated with heavy metals that the well water nearby was undrinkable. Adults argued about laws, while children grew up in carefree oblivion. I gradually understood that the debates in Montana were not simply about the environment, but about human identity between freedom and survival. They chose freedom. Between reality and memory, they chose memory. But that freedom, if not accompanied by responsibility, would become isolation. I once spoke with a group of local militia members. They stockpiled weapons, refused to pay taxes, and believed the government was the enemy. They lived in the middle of fields, flying their own flags, considering their land an independent nation. They were not evil, they were just afraid of losing control, afraid of others making decisions for them. Yet, in that very fear, Montana was slowly losing itself. When everyone wants to keep their part, no one sees the whole. A friend once told me, "We are dividing this state with money, not with land." That statement resonated like a prophecy. The rich bought land to isolate themselves from the community, the poor sold land to survive, and that gap widened daily. In Montana, freedom was being redefined, no longer as the right to live as one wishes, but as the ability to buy enough land not to have to see others. Isolation became the new symbol of power, and amidst the stunning tranquility of the mountains, the cracks in society began to reverberate, small but clear. As I left Bitrot Valley that day, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the river, and I suddenly understood that Montana was not just losing its forests and land, but something even more precious, the sense of belonging to a community. I left the bus area, heading north, where the mountain ranges gradually slid into the shadow of snow, and the rivers took on the dark green hue of melting ice. Along the way, I passed through Butte, the city once called America's Metal Heart. In the early 20th century, it was Montana's pride, where thousands flocked to mine copper, gold, and silver, where the mine lights shone brightly all night like fires of hope. But now, in the city center, there is a giant hole hundreds of meters deep, filled with dark red toxic water. They call it the Berkeley Pit, the largest legacy humans left after a mining frenzy. I stood looking at the calm water and felt like I was looking into the eye of the past. Everything that once brought prosperity to Montana was also what destroyed it. People still believed that as long as there were mines, forests, and land, there would be wealth. But the copper mines were depleted, the mining companies vanished, leaving behind ghost towns and rivers devoid of fish. An old engineer in Butte told me that just cleaning up the toxins in wastewater from the mines cost tens of millions of dollars each year. We dug deep into the earth for gold, and now we have to dig deep into our pockets to atone, he said, his voice heartbreakingly calm. Not just Butte, the entire state of Montana is a network of unhealed wounds. In the Jotman-Lanzusky region, Pegasus Gold once mined gold using the cyanide heap leaching method, a fast and cheap technique that left behind enormous amounts of toxins in the soil. When the company went bankrupt, abandoned chemical reservoirs leaked into the ground, seeping into the water table. The state had to spend tens of millions of dollars on cleanup. But local authorities knew that the chemicals would remain there for centuries, silently killing every stream, every patch of land. There are also less somber stories. Stillwater Mine, the only platinum and palladium mine in the U.S., where operators chose a different path. They signed long-term commitments with local communities, allowing environmental organizations to monitor their operations, even funding salmon research groups. It's rare for a mining company to voluntarily invite others to supervise them. But Stillwater did so because they understood that their mine would exist for hundreds of years, and they could not survive by destroying the very land they depended on. That is proof that sustainability is not a distant dream, but a practical choice. In recent years, other oil and mining companies have also begun to recognize the difference between denial and responsibility. When BP acquired Anaconda's old mines, they could not evade the consequences like smaller mine owners before them. They were too big to disappear. They were forced to clean up. They didn't do it out of goodwill, but out of calculation, knowing that delay would only increase the damage. Even if the motives weren't pure, the results offered a glimmer of hope. I remember an official once saying, "Sometimes we don't need good people, just rational ones." Montana is a microcosm of the world, where kindness, ambition, and blindness collide. Here, I have seen all types of people: those who want to save the forest, those who want to cut it down, those who believe in the market, those who believe in nature. None of them are evil. It's just that each carries a story, a fear, a different understanding of survival. They are all right from their own perspective, and that is what makes them all wrong when viewed from nature's perspective. When I asked a farmer friend if he believed Montana was changing, he just smiled sadly. "Everyone knows, but what good is knowing? We live off this land. If we stop, we die. If we continue, the land will die first." In that statement, I heard the echo of so many civilizations that had collapsed. No one wants to destroy their homeland, but they still do because they see no other way. Some early mornings, I walked along the Bot River. Mist lay on the water like a thin veil. The cry of ducks echoed, then fell silent. Far away, new houses sprouted amidst the grasslands. Their shining roofs reflected the sun. Beneath my feet, the soil was soft and cold, but deep within it were metal remnants from abandoned mines. Nature in Montana was both alive and dead, beautiful and painful. I once thought that collapse was a single event, a sudden fall. But Montana taught me that it is a slow process, beginning with small things. A forest cut down, a river diverted, a house built in the wrong place. A decision justified by immediate gain. Each generation adds another cut, and then one day, the complete picture of disaster emerges. No one wants it, but no one has the power to stop it. When I left Montana for the last time to write about what I had seen, I realized that I was not just telling the story of a state. I was telling the story of humanity itself. We, like Montana, stand between beauty and vulnerability, between aspiration and limitation. We are debating how to live, while the ground beneath our feet erodes daily. Perhaps one day, when our descendants look back, they will see in Montana not just a place of forests and rivers, but a place where the world began to understand itself. To understand that every civilization, no matter how great, must bow to the silent laws of nature. And that in every story of collapse, there is always an opportunity for awakening if humans are brave enough to confront the consequences of their own making. On a small island in the Pacific, where volcanic peaks rise from the deep sea, people once erected giant statues facing the sky. That is the story of Easter Island, where humans built their greatest symbols and also where they personally buried their own civilization. The Moai statues stood majestic, tens of meters tall, weighing tens of tons, carved from volcanic rock, the pride of the Rapa Nui people. They were a mark of power, belief, and the desire for eternity. But hidden behind those silent stone faces was the silent cry of a disaster. Initially, the island was full of giant palm forests, fertile land, abundant birds and fish. When humans arrived, they brought fire, stone tools, and the belief that nature would forever serve them. They cut down trees to clear fields, burned forests for wood to build houses, used boats for fishing, and to transport statues. They believed that each taller statue was a way to get closer to the gods, and that the clan leaders would become immortal if they left behind the most statues. So the forests fell, the last tree was cut down, and no one realized it was the last soul of the island. When the forests disappeared, they also lost the ability to make boats, to venture out to sea, to hunt fish, and to trade. From there, everything began to crack. The land eroded, freshwater sources dried up, food supplies dwindled. The clans that were once united in rituals began to turn against each other. They attacked, burned, and destroyed each other's statues to assert that their gods were stronger. The statues were toppled, shattered. People hunted each other to survive. An island once covered by green forests and sacred rituals was now just stone ruins, bare earth, and silence. When the first Europeans arrived, they found only a few hundred hungry, weak people living amidst the ruins. They could not believe that this very people had once erected those colossal structures. Easter Island is not just an island that collapsed, it is a metaphor for the world. Humans can reach dazzling heights only to blindly destroy the very foundation that sustains them. The survivors did not understand what had happened to them. The collapse came like a curse, but in reality, it did not happen in a day. It was the result of centuries of gradually stripping away their own future. They could not see that the last tree felled was also the death of their lineage. They believed they were building glory, but in fact, they were building a tomb for their own civilization. If we look from afar, that island resembles Earth, a place surrounded by an endless ocean with nowhere else to go. And we are gradually cutting down our last trees while still busy carving statues of glory. Not far away in the same sea, two other small islands, Pitcairn and Henderson, tell another version of the same tragedy. They were links in a network of exchange between three archipelagos. Mangareva provided stone, tools, and food. Pitcairn provided wood and flint. Henderson provided birds and seafood. For centuries, they exchanged and nourished each other with regular sea voyages. But when Mangareva collapsed due to deforestation and famine, the chain of exchange was broken. Pitcairn and Henderson lost their food and material sources, falling into isolation. Their resources were depleted, their populations rapidly declined, eventually disappearing without a trace. When Europeans arrived, they found only pottery shards, a few stone tools, and the foundations of empty houses. No war, no invasion, just a silent death of societies that lost connection, lost the ability to exchange and adapt. What makes these stories so haunting is not just the disaster but the repetition. On Easter Island, they destroyed forests for religious reasons. On Pitcairn, they were depleted because they lost their partners. Though the causes differed, the common thread remains. Humans could not see the long-term consequences of their short-term actions. They were not lacking in intelligence, nor in faith, only in the ability to stop. There were no malicious people, only people who believed they were doing the right thing. I have often thought of the image of the workers on Easter Island using ropes to pull a multi-ton statue, while in the distance, the forest was disappearing. They cheered in pride, believing that a taller statue meant greater glory, but they could not see the silence spreading across the forest. The birds grew fewer, the waves echoed from the bare shore. When they placed the last statue on its pedestal, it was also when the last canoe had rotted away. And when they looked up at their god statues, they did not know that the very deities they created would witness their last day. These forgotten islands teach us that collapse does not come from the outside, but from within each community. No one forced them to cut down trees, no one forced them to continue. But they still did, driven by the worship of power, by the blind belief that the world revolved around them. Easter, Pitcairn, and Henderson are just faded highlights on a map, but their stories are the first draft for humanity's history today. As humans expand cities, burn forests, exploit oceans, and deplete land, I see in it the shadow of the Moai statues. Every skyscraper, every factory, every giant dam. All carry the same belief that we are immortal, that this world will forever endure. But if history has a language, it is reiterating what Easter Island once said. When humans forget their limits, they don't need anyone to destroy them. They will do it themselves, with pride, ceremony, and faith, just as the ancient Rapa Nui people once did. On the other side of the ocean, amidst the desert and red rocks of the American Southwest, another civilization once rose and vanished, the ancestral Puebloans Anasazi. They had no ocean, no palm forests, but they had land, sun, skill, and belief. In Chaco Canyon, they built colossal stone structures, multi-story circular houses, and straight roads cutting through the desert. They cultivated corn, beans, squash, raised turkeys, and created a complex social system that still amazes modern explorers. But like the Pacific Islands, their success was built on fragile ground. As the population grew, agricultural land was continuously exploited, and surrounding forests were cut for building materials and firewood. Rainfall gradually decreased. Streams ran dry. Evidence from tree rings shows that some droughts lasted more than 2 decades in the desert. Just a few years of water scarcity were enough to turn fields into dust, yet they continued because they could not stop. Society had become too complex. Leaders still demanded tribute to maintain power. The more sophisticated a society, the harder it is to change itself, and that very complexity became a burden. Cities like Chaco or Mesa Verde, once regional centers, are now just silent stone blocks. The inhabitants abandoned their homes, scattered to other areas, blending into later Pueblo tribes. There were no great battles, no invasions, just a silent retreat from the very walls they had proudly built. When the environment resisted, all structures of power became meaningless. Further south, the Maya civilization followed a similar path, glorious, sophisticated, then collapsing in its own splendor. From the dense jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, they erected pyramids, temples, and vast plazas from Copan to Palenque. Everywhere shone with writing, mathematics, and astronomy, but behind that magnificence was a familiar vicious cycle. The population grew rapidly, the soil became barren, forests were cut for fuel and agricultural expansion, while the ruling class continued to build colossal structures to demonstrate power. A civilization that reached intellectual peaks, yet failed to maintain the material foundation that sustained it. As food sources declined, city-states fell into war. Leaders could not cooperate. Each believed they were the center of the universe. The wars were not just to seize land, but to claim symbols, temples, sacrificial rituals, statues. Each time they lost a battle, the defeated were sacrificed, and the victors built more temples to thank the gods, further exhausting the populace. The once vibrant cities were gradually abandoned. The green jungle crept in, swallowing the stone. When the Spanish arrived, they found moss-covered ruins, unreadable inscriptions, and pyramids transformed into hills. What truly haunts me is the similarity between the Anasazi and the Maya. Though separated by thousands of miles, both had complex social organizations, achieved brilliant accomplishments, and both collapsed not due to invasion, but due to an imbalance with their environment. The more they developed, the more resources they needed. The more resources they needed, the more they destroyed what sustained life. When the system became too large, no one had enough power to stop it. Remaining Maya records show that the final years were a dense series of rituals. They prayed for rain, offered sacrifices, killed people to appease the gods. But the rain did not come. These were not foolish acts, but the desperation of a civilization that had lost its ability to self-correct. They could not abandon the beliefs that had nurtured them for thousands of years, even when those beliefs were killing them. I think of this whenever I read about modern societies, when we also hold different rituals, conferences, pledges, declarations while the earth still warms and the seas still rise. The collapse of empires in the dust shows that intellect is not enough to save a civilization if that intellect is constrained by habit and power. Both the Anasazi and Maya had intelligent people who observed, who feared, but these warnings could not overcome the frozen power structures. When the interests of the upper class were inextricably linked to the old model, change became impossible. They did not lack understanding. They lacked the ability to break free from their dependence on the very system that created them. If we look closely, in the collapse of the Maya, there is a shadow of the present. Crowded cities, resource wars, decisions made by a minority in the name of the majority, and the belief that technology or rituals can save everything. But no God saved them, just as no miracle will save us if we continue to repeat that mistake. I once walked through Maya ruins in the damp jungle, where stone walls still bore intricate carvings. In the sunlight filtering through the canopy, I felt as if I could hear the hum of an ancient city, the murmuring of people, the drums of rituals, the sound of stones being dragged up the pyramids. And then, all fell silent. No thunder heralded the day of collapse, only a prolonged silence as humans finally departed. When I think of those lost civilizations, I don't feel arrogant for knowing their outcome, but I shiver because everything they once did, we are also doing, only bigger, faster, and more globally. Their collapse is not a story of the past, but a mirror reflecting the present. And if history has meaning, perhaps it is a reminder that true wisdom lies not in how much one builds, but in the ability to know when to stop. Amidst the snow-covered ruins of the North Atlantic, where the Vikings once sailed, carrying ambitions of conquest and building new lands, they left Norway, crossed the cold seas, settled on the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and finally reached Greenland. For them, it was not just a journey for wealth but an affirmation of their courage. A people who believed that nothing could subdue human will. And for a long time, they were right. From small farms, they built prosperous communities, growing barley, raising sheep, building churches, and trading with Europe. But then, like the people on Easter Island or in the Maya region, their strength became the cause of tragedy. The Vikings brought their way of life, religion, and values from Northern Europe, imposing them on a new land without understanding that Greenland was not Norway. They planted trees, farmed and built in the old ways, while the climate was colder, the soil more prone to erosion and winters longer. When the Little Ice Age began, fields froze, livestock died, crops failed. But they still tried to maintain that way of life because it was their pride, their identity. They refused to eat fish like the Inuit, considering it food for savages. They would rather starve than give up their belief in their own superiority. When trade routes with Norway were disrupted, Greenland lost its supply of iron, wood, and food. The ice grew thicker, ships could not dock. Conflicts with the Inuit began, small at first, then turning violent. The Vikings saw them as barbarians, not realizing that it was the Inuit who understood this land best. While the Vikings froze to death in winter, the Inuit still hunted whales and survived blizzards. Two cultures coexisted on one island. One adapted, one perished. A stark lesson in choosing or refusing to change. Archaeologists found ruined churches, sheep pens buried in snow, human skeletons with broken rib traces of hunger, cold, and despair. There is no evidence of a final war. They just disappeared, one by one. When winters became too long and summers too short for farming, their death was not resounding but silent, like snow falling on abandoned roofs. The last records spoke of villagers praying for ships from Norway to return. But that ship never came. Meanwhile, in Iceland, a land no less harsh, a different story unfolded. Iceland did not collapse because they learned to adapt. They knew that their forests could not regenerate as quickly as in Europe, so they limited logging. They created strict laws regarding land and livestock. They established a central council to arbitrate disputes and manage resources. They maintained trade networks with Europe, expanded fishing, and gradually changed their livelihood model. Iceland did not have more than Greenland, but they had something the Vikings in Greenland did not: the ability to change themselves before being forced to. From that perspective, the story of the Vikings is not just a tragedy, but also a testament to human nature. We always want to bring what is familiar to new lands, even if those values are no longer suitable. We are loyal to the past to the point of sacrificing the future. And that, from Easter Island to Greenland, is the common denominator of every collapse. However, not all societies chose that path. On Tikopia, a small island in the Solomon Archipelago, the inhabitants survived for 3,000 years without perishing. They too faced famine and population crises, but they chose a harsh path, restricting childbirth, prohibiting overhunting, maintaining the population within the island's carrying capacity. They understood that survival lay not in expansion, but in the ability to know when enough is enough. In the New Guinean highlands, people practiced rotational farming to allow the soil to rest, used natural fertilizers, and conserved water sources. They had no modern technology, but they understood nature's laws of balance better than any civilization. In Tokugawa, Japan, when forests were devastated, the government established a strict management system, controlling logging, replanting trees, and considering environmental protection and ethical responsibility for everyone. These were societies that survived not through strength, but through discipline and foresight. I always feel that these examples are more important because they prove that collapse is not destiny. Just as humans can choose death, they can also choose life by learning to live differently. Successful societies are not perfect, but they share one thing: they listen to the environment and accept changing values if necessary. From the Polynesian Islands to the snowy North Atlantic, from the Central American rainforests to the Asian highlands, history has spoken the same sentence. A society never dies because of nature, but because of how it reacts to nature. When people adapt, they survive. When they refuse to learn, they disappear. Every civilization that ever fell, be it Rapa Nui, Maya, or Greenland, had a chance to be saved if they dared to abandon their old pride. And that is what makes me believe that what the past leaves behind is not ashes, but guidance. Every ruined civilization leaves footprints leading to a different path, where those who can see will understand that survival does not come from conquest, but from understanding. But if we continue to walk like the Vikings on the ice, clinging to the belief that this world will bend to our will, then, like them, we will only leave behind traces buried in cold snow, waiting for someone from another time to discover and wonder why a great people vanished. Rwanda, viewed from afar, is a green strip of land in the heart of Africa, where rolling hills undulate like waves. Terraced fields covered in corn and bananas stretch to the horizon. Anyone who hasn't been there might think it's a peaceful, fertile place, blessed by nature. But beneath that soil are cracks that no one was willing to see. A small nation bearing immense population pressure, where land became the only asset and also the spark for tragedy. For decades, Rwanda was seen as an example of African agricultural resilience. Diligent residents, meticulously cultivated land, dense fields, no wasted space. But this very success sowed the seeds of disaster. Each generation, the land was divided further. A family with 4 children, each child inheriting a small plot, which then got subdivided for their own children and grandchildren. Thus, the initially fertile land became tiny parcels, insufficient to sustain anyone. By the early 1990s, Rwanda's population density surpassed that of Europe, while agricultural productivity steadily declined. The land no longer had room to breathe. Population pressure weighed heavily on every field, every home. When land ran out, people began to dispute over everything from the boundary between 2 gardens to a well, escalating from small arguments to prolonged hatred. Violence didn't erupt immediately. It accumulated, simmering like coals under ashes, fueled by fear, envy, and despair. A weak central government was unable to control it, while local ruling groups exploited this fear to maintain power. When economic crisis hit, when crops failed, people had nothing left to cling to but resentment. Outsiders often say the Rwandan genocide was the result of ethnic conflict between Hutu and Tutsi. True, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The root lay in a society pushed to its ecological limits without finding a way out. When resources were insufficient for everyone, people began to redivide the world with blood. Political slogans, hateful propaganda were merely the language of a long-standing hunger for land, hunger for power, hunger for hope. I once walked through the hills where blood had flowed amidst the fields. Farmers now plowed and planted corn on the very land that had been a burial ground. The earth still gives life, as if it wants to forget. But humans cannot forget. Rwanda did not collapse in a day. It collapsed with every inch of ravaged land, every child who didn't go to school, every depleted harvest. When the population exceeded nature's capacity, conflict became destiny. The tragedy is that Rwanda had clear warning signs. Scientists, international organizations spoke of environmental crisis, predicted famine, but all warnings were ignored because everyone believed those green hills would remain fertile forever. Then, in 1994, within a few months, nearly 1 million people were killed, not due to sudden hatred, but because of a storm nurtured by decades of scarcity. When survivors recounted, they spoke more of hunger than of anger. When there was no land to farm, no food for children, human hearts became twisted. A farmer might kill a neighbor just for a garden a few meters wider. No ideals needed, just hunger. And when those in power exploited that hunger to sow hatred, disaster became unstoppable. Rwanda is proof of how ecological pressure can transform into social violence. After the massacre, many wondered why humanity could be so cruel, but if one looks closely, it was not innate cruelty but a desperate reaction when all options were closed. A society cannot exist if the land is insufficient to feed its people, just as morality cannot be maintained on an empty stomach. Rwanda did not die from war, but from a simple equation no one was willing to solve: too many people, too little land. Today, the nation is reviving. New villages are springing up. The government is implementing population control policies and stricter land management, but the scars remain, reminding us that political stability is only sustainable when there is a strong ecological foundation. Without land, without water, every political system is fragile. Looking at Rwanda, I see the shadow of many other places in the world. Crowded nations where people jostle on barren land, where forests are cut to grow food, where water sources gradually dwindle. We look at Rwanda and think it's an African story, but in reality, it's a mirror reflecting the future of all humanity if we don't stop. When I left Rwanda, the plane flew over lush green hills. I suddenly realized that green was not a symbol of life but a thin veil covering a painful memory. And like those lost civilizations, Rwanda taught me a simple lesson: humans cannot live separate from the limits of the land. Because when the land dies, we die with it. Amidst the azure Caribbean Sea lies an island with two opposing souls. To the west is Haiti, arid, windswept by salty breezes across barren hills. To the east is the Dominican Republic, where forests are still green, rivers still flow, and mountains retain the color of life. Two halves on the same island, Hispaniola, sharing the same climate, the same motherland. Yet their fates diverged in two directions. The same environment, the same starting point, but vastly different outcomes due to how each society chose to confront crisis. When the French and Spanish landed on this island, they brought not only weapons, but also two models of governance. Western Haiti was transformed by the French into a sugar cane colony, with hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans forced to work. Forests were cut for agricultural land and to fuel sugar mills. When the slave revolution erupted and Haiti gained independence, the people abolished the old regime but also broke down the land management system. They divided land among themselves, large plots into small ones. Each person farmed as they pleased, with no planning, no windbreaks, no conservation laws. Freedom came, but with it came depletion. The Eastern Dominican Republic, on the other hand, was controlled by Spain and later by more centralized successor governments. Despite many upheavals, they maintained a strong governance structure and the understanding that forests were a national asset. While Haiti cut down forests to live, the Dominican Republic ordered forests to be planted to survive. These policies were not popular with the people. They were tough, even authoritarian. But the result is that when viewed from satellite, the border between the two countries is chillingly clear, one side deep green, the other brown-gray. I once stood at the Massacer Pass where I could see both sides. On one side were mountains covered in cloud forests, on the other, only bare land, poor houses crammed together. The feeling was like seeing two versions of the future, one where humanity chose restraint, one where it chose extravagance. Haiti did not collapse due to lack of resources, but because it lacked the discipline to protect its resources. The Dominican Republic survived not because of wealth, but because it had a state that dared to resist short-term habits. People often say nature favored the Dominican Republic, but that is a misconception. Haiti and the Dominican Republic lie on the same mountain range, receive the same rainfall, and endure the same storms. The only difference lies in human decisions. Joaquin Balaguer of the Dominican Republic, a leader with an autocratic style, saw what few leaders of his time understood. If forests are lost, water will disappear, and if water disappears, the nation will disintegrate. He enacted strict laws prohibiting logging, deployed the army to protect forests, and imprisoned those who practiced illegal slash-and-burn agriculture. The people were indignant, calling him mad. But decades later, when major hurricanes swept through the Caribbean, only the Dominican Republic had forests to hold the soil, while Haiti was devastated. I visited Haiti after a rainstorm. With no trees, water poured straight down, carrying away soil, homes, and livestock. Children swam in mud, adults tried to salvage corn from flooded fields. The land was no longer strong enough to feed the people, so people went up the mountains to cut trees for charcoal to sell. The vicious cycle repeated. Poverty led to deforestation, deforestation led to poverty. And when I crossed the border back into the Dominican Republic, I saw the opposite scene: dense forests, clear streams. People worked on carefully maintained terraced fields. The two halves of Hispaniola are like two parallel experiments, where people began life on shared land but chose different values. Haiti chose absolute individual freedom. The Dominican Republic chose collective discipline. One side viewed forests as an obstacle, the other viewed them as a bulwark, and only one side remains standing. How humans organize power is precisely how they organize their relationship with nature. One cannot blame the Haitian people. Their history is one of slavery, resistance, and centuries of exploitation. When they finally gained freedom, they only wanted to enjoy what had been forbidden. But freedom could not save them when the land was barren, when each small field could not provide enough food for the family. Weak, corrupt governments came and went, with no one patient enough to think of the future. Meanwhile, the Dominican Republic chose the opposite path. They curbed population growth, controlled timber exports, and invested in ecotourism. One side lived in a cycle of destruction and planting, the other lived in a cycle of restoration. When viewed from the air, the border between the two countries is a straight line, as if someone had cut the island in half with a knife. But if one looks more closely, it is the border between two philosophies of life. One side believes that life is a natural right, the other believes that life is a responsibility. One side lost its forests in exchange for the present, the other preserved its forests to preserve the future. And the ultimate outcome was not predetermined by fate, but by choices repeated through generations. In today's world, Hispaniola is not just a Caribbean story, it is a microcosm of this planet. The same Earth, but each nation, each individual, chooses different ways to confront limits. There are places that still cut down forests to build roads. There are places that begin to plant forests to breathe. As I stood on the mountaintop looking down at the two colors of the land, I understood that all natural borders eventually disappear, leaving only borders between mindsets, between those who dare to look far ahead and those who live only for today. And in the space between the two, I see the question that remains unanswered. Will humanity choose to be the Haiti or the Dominican Republic of the future? Will we continue to exploit until the land is bare, or will we stop and protect what remains? Hispaniola is not just an island. It is a metaphor for the entire world, a world standing at its own precipice, where every small decision can be a step across or a step back from the abyss. I remember my first time in China, standing amidst the teeming crowds in Beijing. I felt like I was stepping into the beating heart of the planet. Streets that never slept, factories running all night, millions of people moving in a relentless rhythm. A giant awakening, powerful, ambitious, and full of contradictions. Here, in the same scene, one could see both prosperity and collapse happening simultaneously. No country in human history has grown as fast as China in a few decades. Hundreds of millions of people escaped poverty, cities sprang up like mushrooms, and structures reached for the clouds. But behind that dazzling picture, the environment bore a colossal cost. Air pollution turned the sky gray, river water was black as ink, agricultural land was contaminated, and millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Many northern regions had turned into deserts, encroaching tens of kilometers south each year. I traveled through villages near the Gobi Desert, where golden sand gradually swallowed rice fields and roads. People migrated en masse. Villages were abandoned, leaving only crumbling roofs and dry wells. In other areas, rivers, once the lifeblood of civilization, were now dry beds, their water diverted to feed steel and cement factories. Farmers had no land, and cities choked on smoke. All this unfolded in a brutal logic. To grow, one must consume. To consume, one must destroy. China is the most vivid proof of this century's paradox. Developing to live, but development itself is a way of self-destruction. And this paradox is not because this nation lacks intelligence, but because of its sheer scale. Every wrong decision here affects not just thousands, but hundreds of millions. When an economy grows at all costs, every mistake is magnified exponentially. However, in that chaos, I also saw a glimmer of hope in China. When a problem is recognized, people can act with a speed few other nations can match. When Beijing's air pollution exceeded safe levels, thousands of factories were shut down in just a few weeks. When the government decided to plant forests, hundreds of millions of trees were planted in a few years. The concentrated power of a colossal apparatus is both a danger and a unique opportunity for change. China is not just a lesson in destruction, but also an experiment in the self-saving capacity of a modern society. Halfway around the world, in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia tells a different story, less noisy but no less profound. A vast continent, boundless land, yet one of the driest places on Earth. When the first Europeans arrived, they saw grasslands and thought it was an agricultural paradise. They brought sheep, cattle, wheat, and farming methods from Europe, not realizing that the soil here was too thin, water too scarce, and the ecosystem too fragile. They burned forests, cleared land, turned rivers into reservoirs, and within a few generations, fertile lands became deserts. Faulty irrigation systems led to soil salinization. Massive rivers like the Murray-Darling dried up, killing fish en masse. I once heard an old farmer say, "We thought this land was like England until it died." Australia is proof that knowledge without indigenous understanding can lead to disaster. Yet, unlike many other places, Australia managed to awaken by the mid-20th century. When they realized they were headed for a dead end, they began to change. Environmental protection movements emerged, water management laws were tightened, and people relearned how to live in harmony with their land. They used technology to restore forests, studied climate, and changed their ranching methods. It is a rare nation that dared to admit its mistakes and began to correct them while there was still a chance. I remember the feeling of standing in the Simpson Desert. Dry winds swept across the red dunes like fire. Not far away, a solar farm stretched like a sea reflecting brilliant light. That image was a perfect metaphor. Humans and nature, once in opposition, were now trying to find a way to coexist. Australia understood that they could not fight the environment, they had to learn to live with it. Looking back at the journey from Rwanda to Haiti, then to China and Australia, I see a continuous thread. Every society that collapsed or survived did so not because they were poor or rich, but because of how they chose to confront their limits. Rwanda failed to recognize its land limits. Haiti failed to understand the value of its forests. China is learning that lesson on a planetary scale. And Australia is proof that humans can correct their mistakes if they are brave enough. The difference between collapse and survival has never been about resources or technology, but about perception. We are not destroyed by scarcity, but by blindness. Ancient civilizations proved this, and now modern societies are replaying the same script, only on a larger scale. From a small island in the Pacific to a billion-person superpower, the rule remains unchanged. Nature is always a partner, never an adversary. If there is anything I learned after traveling through these lands, it is the simple but hard-to-accept truth. Humans cannot negotiate with limits. We can only understand, respect, and adapt to them. And perhaps the future of the world will be decided not by those who are strongest, but by those who understand how weak they are before nature. There are tragedies that do not come from nature, but from the very silence of humans in the face of what they know to be true. Humans can recognize disaster, even predict it accurately, yet still continue to walk, as if knowledge is a talisman that makes them immune to consequences. All societies that have collapsed shared one thing: they were not blind, they just chose not to see. They saw forests disappearing, land becoming barren, crops failing, but they still believed it wasn't that bad yet. The death of a civilization rarely comes suddenly. It is a long series of individually rational decisions that, when combined, become irrational. There are 4 reasons why humans fail to save themselves. First, they do not recognize the problem is coming because natural changes are too slow and silent. A forest loses trees row by row, a river gradually dries up season by season. A fish stock dwindles each year. No one notices the difference until it completely disappears. They are born into change, so they consider it normal. Second, even when they recognize it, they still do not act because every action has a political, economic, or emotional cost. A farmer knows the soil is barren but cannot stop farming, because stopping means starvation. A government knows resources are depleting but cannot tighten regulations for fear of losing growth. And an individual knows they are contributing to degradation but chooses to remain silent because everyone else does too. Third, when they do start to act, humans often act in the wrong way. They apply old solutions to new problems, like the Vikings in Greenland bringing European agricultural models to a frozen region, or modern societies using the same development logic to solve the consequences of that very development. They think that if a method once brought success, then doing more of it will overcome difficulties. But in nature, every success has its limits. Exceeding those limits, it becomes the cause of destruction. And finally, by the time humans are willing to change, it is too late. When forests are gone, the climate changes, the land collapses, there is nothing left to fix. They only recognize the problem when the price to pay has exceeded the possibility of redemption. These mistakes are not unique to any one person, but are inherent in humanity. We are born with short-term vision, reacting quickly to direct dangers, but being oblivious to things that happen slowly and far away. A lion charges, we run immediately. But a global warming trend, we just discuss. The slow pace of nature is an anesthetic that lulls us into complacency. And while we lull ourselves with the illusion of control, the system around us quietly loses balance. The paradox is that the more intelligent a society, the more easily it gets stuck in old thought patterns. Intellect can become shackles when it serves power instead of truth. The Maya had accurate astronomical calendars, the Vikings had strong social organization, but both were bound by the cultural values they revered. For the Vikings, eating fish was a lowly act, so they let fish fill the rivers but still starved. For the Maya, temples were symbols of power, so they continued to build more while the people starved, as if bricks and stones could replace rice. And in the modern world, we are no different. Governments still inject money into growth even though they know it devastates the environment. Corporations still burn coal even though they understand it destroys the future. When I observe modern societies, I realize that failure lies not in not knowing, but in knowing too much. We know everything about pollution, climate change, resource depletion. But this knowledge does not make us act faster, because in every decision there is the resistance of self-interest, of power, of the fear of loss. A politician fears losing votes, a businessman fears losing profit, a citizen fears losing convenience. So everyone waits, waiting for others to sacrifice first. Awareness is the first step to salvation, but if we don't turn it into action, knowledge is merely a witness to destruction. The people in Greenland knew winters were getting longer. The people on Easter Island knew trees were dwindling. The people of Maya knew the land was dying. But they believed there was still time, and that is the most dangerous belief, believing that disaster will come slower than reality. Historically, every dying civilization thought itself different, more special than the past. Today, as technologies like AI, robots, and big data expand human capabilities, many believe we have transcended ecological limits, but the truth is the opposite. We only push those limits further, falling into new abysses. AI can help us predict, but it cannot choose for us. It can calculate every probability, but it cannot force humans to live more ethically. If knowledge is light, then will is the feet. Without will, light only illuminates a path that no one is willing to walk. Looking back, I understand that past civilizations did not die of ignorance, but of arrogance. They believed they understood the rules of nature, but nature is not a game that can be won, but a dialogue that if you don't listen, you will be excluded from. Humans are not destroyed by natural disasters, but by how they react to them. And that still holds true, from the fields of Rwanda to the smog-filled cities of China. If there is an immutable law, it is that every system confident it will live forever is already beginning to die. Death does not come from outside. It germinates in choices that everyone knows are wrong but still makes. From a piece of forest cut, a river filled, a word said to postpone. That postponement has buried entire civilizations. And if we don't learn to act rightly while there is still time, then one day, the people who live after us will read about this world as we read about Easter Island, with the same painful question. What were they thinking when they cut down the last tree? Humans have created a paradox called the tragedy of the commons, in which every individual, every nation, every company acts rationally for itself, but the collective outcome leads to destruction. A fisherman catches another net of fish for fear others will do so. An oil company extracts more oil for fear competitors will seize market share. A nation increases industry for fear of being left behind. No one does evil. But the result is an empty ocean, polluted skies, an exhausted planet. When individual interests are not constrained by collective limits, the death of the system is only a matter of time. I once visited New Guinea, where an oil mine was operated by a multinational corporation. There, they dared to do what few others had: collaborate with conservation organizations and local communities for controlled extraction. They built pipelines to avoid pristine forests, established conservation funds, and invested in training indigenous people. Though the motive was still profit, at least they understood that long-term existence could only come when the environment was preserved. That was not redemption, but the first step of awakening. In the modern world, where businesses have power comparable to nations, ethics are no longer a personal concept, they are a survival strategy. But not everyone learns that lesson. The global fishing industry is following the exact path of the Easter Islanders, exploiting to the very end, then lamenting when there is nothing left. Energy companies continue to burn coal and get rich because they believe technology will save them from the consequences they themselves cause. But AI, data, or renewable energy are just tools. The real problem is that we still think we can separate growth from natural limits. When the mindset of development at all costs still prevails, every new technology is merely a way to delay collapse, not prevent it. Viewed globally, the factors causing collapse are no longer unfamiliar. Deforestation, land degradation, pollution, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, climate change, population explosion, war, injustice, and moral crisis. These 12 cracks do not exist in isolation. They intertwine into a network suffocating the world. When we cut down forests, we lose land. When land is lost, water disappears. When water disappears, people migrate, conflicts erupt. And then people blame each other as if the tragedy didn't start with their own decisions. What haunts me most is the repetition, from Rwanda to Haiti, from China to Australia. Every society had a chance to stop, but they didn't, for familiar reasons: fear of losing profits, fear of falling behind, fear of change. Humans would rather face a certain disaster than accept uncertain change. This fear, not nature, is humanity's real enemy. Yet, amidst these dark patches, there is still light. Some nations have begun to prioritize long-term interests over immediate gains. Some companies understand that environmental protection is no longer an ethical responsibility, but a survival strategy. Some individuals, scientists, and small communities are quietly restoring forests, cleaning rivers, and teaching their children that true wealth lies in how much can regenerate. Humanity's ability to survive lies not in strength, but in humility. We don't need to control the earth. We just need to learn to live in harmony with it. If there's one thing the past teaches the present, it is that no civilization perished because it was too weak, only because it was too overconfident. The Easter Islanders thought they were different from other islands. The Vikings in Greenland believed they were descendants of unconquerable warriors. The Maya believed the gods would protect them because they had offered enough sacrifices. And we, the people of the 21st century, believe that technology and AI will save us from our own mistakes. But all these beliefs share the same structure: arrogance wrapped in rationality. I do not write these words to sow fear. I write because I believe there is still an opportunity. Humans may not avoid mistakes, but they can learn to correct them. We have enough knowledge, enough tools, and above all, enough memories not to repeat the past. We don't need to find a new planet to live on. We just need to live differently on this one. Because if there is anything that distinguishes humanity from lost civilizations, it is not strength, but the ability to self-reflect. And if one day future generations look back at our era, I hope they will not have to say that we knew but chose to ignore. I hope they will see that in the brief moment between knowledge and despair, humanity chose the harder path, the path of awakening. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this book is not in the chapters about lost civilizations, but in how we see ourselves through them. Every society that ever collapsed thought it was special. They had faith, technology, and power, until the ground beneath their feet cracked and the forests around them turned to ash. The question is no longer why they disappeared, but why we are still walking the same path, even though we know the outcome. The book reminds us that wisdom saves no one if it is not accompanied by humility. When humans believe they can master nature, they forget that they are part of it. All progress, all inventions, even AI, are meaningless if they make us forget our own limits. Collapse never begins with disaster. It begins at the moment humans stop listening to the smallest signs of imbalance. And perhaps the most important question each person should ask themselves is not whether humanity will perish, but what part am I playing? Regeneration or ruin? When we flip a switch, when we consume, when we remain silent about what is wrong, we are all choosing a side. No one is exempt. If you have listened this far, perhaps you feel that this is not just a story of the past, but a silent prophecy for the future. So what do you think? Will we be brave enough to change before we are forced to change? Can this generation be the first to learn how to live sustainably instead of just talking about it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, not to argue, but to reflect together on how we are living.